The morning light over New Alexandria was the color of old honey. I remember that because I was standing in the shadow of the obsidian spire, watching the sunrise paint the city in gold and amber, and I thought, this is what peace looks like. This is what 10,000 years of careful building looks like. My name is Elias Vance. I was 37 years old when the galaxy changed forever. 37, and I'd spent 15 of those years as a civilian contractor in the Sol Defense Corps, which meant I spent most of my time staring at screens and running diagnostics on weapons systems I hoped I would never see fired in anger. The spire cast a long shadow across the residential sector, and I was early for my shift, early enough to watch the sunrise, early enough to see the Skytrams sliding silent overhead, carrying workers and students and families to their daily lives, early enough to smell the synthetic coffee from the vendor cart on the corner, where old Marta was already setting up her stall. "Elias," she called out, her voice carrying across the plaza, "you want your usual before the rush." I waved, in a minute Marta just enjoying the view. She laughed, a warm sound that cut through the cool morning air. "You enjoy that view every morning. You'd think it was new to you." "Maybe I just appreciate things," I called back. She shook her head, still smiling, and went back to arranging her cups. Marta had been running that cart for longer than I'd been alive. She'd seen the city grow from a cluster of domes to the gleaming metropolis it was now. She'd seen the war memorials go up, the ones that honored the last real conflict humanity had fought, 9,000 years ago, against the Vorkath horde, back when we were still figuring out how to be a spacefaring species. Back when we still had things to prove. Now we were the old guard, the species that had been around so long that we'd become a fixture, a constant, a given. The humans. The ones who'd survived the Great Expansion, the Dark Centuries, the collapse of the core. The ones who'd pulled ourselves out of the rubble of our own making and built something that had lasted. 10,000 years since humanity had been challenged by anyone who mattered. 10,000 years since we'd had to fight for our survival. The obsidian spire was a monument to that longevity. It rose 20 kilometers into the sky, a jagged shard of polished black stone that caught the light like a blade. At its base, the memorial garden stretched for acres, filled with the names of every human who died in every conflict we'd ever fought. The last name had been added 9,000 years ago. I'd walked through those gardens once. I'd stood in front of the wall of remembrance and tried to comprehend the sheer weight of history carved into that stone. Tens of millions of names, tens of millions of lives given so that we could have this morning, this sky, this peace. It was humbling. It was also, if I'm being honest, a little abstract. Those names belonged to a past so distant that it felt like mythology. The Vorkath were a species we'd wiped out to the last individual, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. They'd come for us with teeth and fire, and we'd responded with terrible, beautiful efficiency. We'd been young then, desperate, fierce. Now we were old, and old empires don't have to prove anything. I finally walked over to Marta's cart and ordered my coffee. The cup was warm in my hands, and the first sip was perfect, bitter and sweet, with just a hint of the cinnamon she ground fresh every morning. "Big day?" she asked, her eyes crinkling. "Same as every day," I said. "Monitors, diagnostics, boring reports." "Boring is good," she said. "Boring means nobody's shooting at us." I nodded. That was the thing about peace. It was, by definition, boring. We traded excitement for stability. We traded danger for comfort. We traded the adrenaline of the unknown for the quiet satisfaction of the everyday. I didn't realize then how much I'd come to take that for granted. The Defense Corps headquarters was a squat, utilitarian building at the edge of the administrative sector. It was the only structure in New Alexandria that wasn't beautiful, and I think that was intentional. The architects wanted to remind us that our safety required something less than aesthetic perfection. The lobby was crowded this morning. That wasn't unusual, Shift change always brought a flood of personnel through the security checkpoints. But something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a crackle of energy that I couldn't quite place. Corporal Davis was at the front desk, her face set in a frown that was unusual for her. Davis was normally the smiling one, the one who made jokes about the monotony of our work. Today, she looked like she'd swallowed something sour. "Vance," she said, waving me over, "the Admiral wants to see you." I stopped mid-stride. "Admiral Chen, why?" Davis shrugged, but there was something guarded in her expression. "Didn't say, just said to send you up as soon as you arrived." I nodded, my mind racing. Admiral Chen was the commander of the Seoul Defense Corps, a position she'd held for 7 years. She was a legend, a veteran of the only conflict humanity had faced in the last 5 centuries, a skirmish with a pirate fleet that had tried to raid our outer colonies. She'd led the response personally, and the pirates had learned the hard way that humanity's weapons didn't rust with age. But she didn't call junior contractors to her office. That wasn't how the chain of command worked. I took the elevator to the top floor, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The corridors were silent, the usual bustle of the administrative wing noticeably absent. The door to Admiral Chen's office was ajar, and I could hear voices inside. "Impossible to confirm. The sensors are picking up something, but it doesn't match any known configuration." "Run it again, and this time use the old protocols, the ones from the Vorkath era." I recognized the second voice as Admiral Chen's. It was calm, measured, the voice of someone who'd seen too much to panic easily. But there was an edge to it that I'd never heard before. I knocked on the door frame. "Come in," Chen said. She was sitting behind her desk, a holographic display floating in front of her face. The display showed a star chart, with a cluster of red dots pulsing at the edge of human space. Captain Rivera was standing to her right, his face pale under his dark skin. "Vance," Chen said, waving me in. "Good, close the door." I did, and the room suddenly felt very small. "You've been with the Corps for 15 years, Chen said, not looking away from the display. "You started as a sensor technician. You've worked on every major monitoring system we have." "Yes, Admiral." "Then you know what this is." She gestured at the display. "Tell me what you see." I stepped closer, studying the hologram. The red dots were clustered at the edge of the Sol sector, just beyond the Kuiper belt. They were moving, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, and there were a lot of them, hundreds, maybe thousands. "Unidentified contacts," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden tightness in my chest. "But they're not moving like ships. Their trajectory is too uniform, too organized." "Organized," Chen repeated. "That's the word I used. What else?" I studied the pattern. The dots were arranged in a sphere, a perfect geometric formation that was almost too precise to be natural, and they were getting closer. Slowly, inexorably, like a net tightening around us. "This isn't a pirate fleet," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "This is a military formation, a coordinated one." Chen nodded slowly. "That's what I thought, but here's the thing, Vance. This formation, I've seen it before, in the archives, in the records of the Vorkath War." The air in the room seemed to thicken. "That's impossible," I said. "The Vorkath are extinct. We made sure of that." "We did," Chen agreed. "But someone's using their tactics, someone who studied their battle formations, someone who's been paying attention to how we fight." She swiped her hand across the display and the hologram shifted. A new image appeared, a ship, but unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily the size of a dreadnought, but its shape was wrong. It was too angular, too aggressive, like a creature designed specifically for war. "We picked this up 6 hours ago," Chen said. "It's the lead ship. The formation is built around it." "Has there been any communication?" I asked. "Any attempt to make contact?" "Nothing. They're not responding to any of our hails. They're not acknowledging our presence at all." I felt a chill run down my spine. In all of human history, every species we'd encountered had been willing to talk. Even the ones who'd started out hostile had eventually come to the negotiating table. The idea that something was approaching us without any attempt at communication was deeply wrong. "What do they want?" I asked. Chen's expression was hard. "That's what I'm trying to figure out, and why I called you here. You've been working on the sensor arrays for 15 years. You know them better than anyone. I need you to go through the data, find anything that might tell us what we're dealing with." I nodded, but my mind was already racing. 15 years of diagnostics and reports had never prepared me for this. 15 years of routine had lulled me into a sense of security that was shattering around me like glass. "Get to work," Chen said, "and Vance." I paused at the door. "Don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. I don't want to start a panic until we know what we're facing." "Understood, Admiral." I walked back to my office in a daze. The corridors seemed emptier than before, the faces of my colleagues unfamiliar. They were going about their routines, unaware that something was approaching us from the void. Something that had learned from our enemies. Something that had studied our weaknesses. Something that had come for us. Part 2, The Shadow in the Void. The sensor data was worse than I'd imagined. I spent the next 12 hours locked in my office, surrounded by flickering holograms and scrolling readouts. My eyes burned from staring at the screens, and my coffee had long gone cold, but I couldn't stop. Every new piece of information painted a more disturbing picture. The formation was massive. At least 500 ships, arranged in a sphere that was nearly 1,000,000 kilometers across. At its center was the flagship, the massive dreadnought that Chen had shown me, but it was surrounded by smaller vessels, each one configured for combat. They were warships, every single one of them. But it wasn't the size of the fleet that bothered me. It was the patterns. The formation was constantly shifting, rotating, adjusting. It was like watching a living creature breathe, and the movements were eerily familiar. I pulled up the archives, the Vorkath war records that had been sealed for 9,000 years. It took me 3 hours to get access, and I had to call in favors from half a dozen colleagues. But when I finally saw the tactical data, my blood ran cold. The formations matched, exactly. The Vorkath had used a fighting style that relied on constant movement, on flowing around an enemy's defenses and striking from unexpected angles. They'd been brilliant tacticians, ruthless and relentless, and we'd nearly lost to them. We'd only won because we'd adapted faster, because we'd been willing to sacrifice everything to survive. But this fleet, these ships, they weren't Vorkath. They were something else, something that had studied the Vorkath's tactics and improved on them. I found the first anomaly in the propulsion signatures. The ships were using a drive system that I'd never seen before, something that combined conventional thrust with a form of gravitational manipulation. It was elegant, efficient, and far more advanced than anything humanity possessed. And it was generating a unique energy signature, a signature that matched nothing in our databases. I ran the comparison 3 times, convinced I was making a mistake, but the results were the same. These ships weren't from any known species. They weren't from any known sector. They were from somewhere else entirely. I sat back in my chair, staring at the hologram floating in front of me. The ships were still approaching, still moving with that terrible, inexorable precision. They'd be at the edge of our defensive perimeter in 48 hours. And we had no idea what they wanted. The call came at 300 hours. Admiral Chen's voice was calm, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Vance, I need you in the command center, now." I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my jacket and ran. The command center was chaos. Officers were gathered around holographic displays, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions and commands. Admiral Chen stood at the center of it all, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the main display. "What happened?" I asked, pushing through the crowd. Chen didn't look away from the display. "They're accelerating, and they're transmitting." Transmitting? What did they say? Here, she gestured at the display, and a burst of static filled the room. Then, a voice, alien, mechanical, but unmistakably intelligent. "Humanity, we have observed your species for a very long time. You have grown complacent. You have grown weak. You have forgotten what it means to fight." The voice paused, and in that silence I could hear my own heartbeat. "We have studied your history, we have studied your tactics, we have studied your wars, and we have come to a conclusion. Your species no longer deserves to exist. Your empire no longer deserves to expand. You have had your time. Now it is ours." The transmission ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone in the back of the room started to laugh, a hysterical, nervous sound that cut through the silence like a knife. "They're challenging us," a lieutenant said, his voice shaking. "They're actually challenging humanity." "They're declaring war," Chen said, her voice flat. "They're declaring war on the Sol Defense Corps, on the entire human species." "With what?" the lieutenant demanded. "We haven't fought a war in 9,000 years. We don't have the military capacity to." "We have the capacity," Chen said, cutting him off. "We've just never had to use it, and that's the problem." She turned to face me, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. "Vance, you've analyzed their ships. Tell me what they're capable of." I took a breath, forcing myself to focus. "They're faster than us, more maneuverable. Their weapons systems appear to be more advanced than anything we have, and their defensive shields are, I don't know how to describe it. They're layered, multiple overlapping fields that would take enormous firepower to breach." "Can we stop them?" I hesitated. "Theoretically, yes. If we mobilized everything we have, we could put up a defense, but it would be costly, and even then, I don't know if we could win. We've been at peace for 9,000 years. Our military is focused on defense, on monitoring, on maintaining stability. We haven't had to fight a war in generations. Our soldiers are trained, yes, but they've never seen combat. They've never faced a hostile force." "The Vorketh. We're a primitive species compared to these ships. They had numbers, but their technology was crude. This fleet is different. This fleet has been designed specifically to counter our strengths." Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to the room. "I want a full mobilization. All stations, all ships. I want the planetary defense network online within the hour. I want every soldier, every pilot, every technician ready to fight." "But Admiral..." "I don't want to hear excuses." Her voice was cold, hard, sharp as glass. "I want action. We have 48 hours before they reach our perimeter. We're going to use every second of that time to prepare." The room erupted into activity. Officers rushed to their stations, their faces grim. I stood frozen in the center of it all, watching the chaos unfold around me. "You too, Vance," Chen said, her voice softer now. "I need you on the sensor arrays. I need to know exactly what we're facing." I nodded, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. 10,000 years of peace. 10,000 years of building, of growing, of believing that we were untouchable. And now, a species from the void was telling us that our time was over. I thought about the memorial gardens, with their tens of millions of names. I thought about the war that had ended 9,000 years ago, when humanity had faced extinction and refused to surrender. I thought about my ancestors who had fought and died so that I could have this morning, this sky, this peace. And I wondered if they'd forgive us for what we were about to do. Part 3, The Call to Arms. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. I barely left the sensor array room. I lived on ration bars and synthetic coffee, my body running on adrenaline and sheer determination. The holograms never stopped flickering, the data never stopped flowing, and every new piece of information brought fresh horrors. The fleet was larger than I'd initially estimated. Closer to 800 ships, each one bristling with weapons I'd never seen before. Their formation was constantly shifting, adapting, improving. It was like watching a predator stalk its prey. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite identify. Their transmissions had become more frequent, and they'd started targeting specific installations. Military bases, shipyards, command centers. They were sending the same message over and over, variations on the same theme. Humanity, you are weak. Humanity, you are obsolete. Humanity, your time is over. It was psychological warfare, plain and simple. They were trying to demoralize us before the fighting even started. And it was working. I saw it in the faces of my colleagues, the fear, the uncertainty, the creeping sense of dread that had settled over the entire Defense Corps like a shroud. We'd been at peace for so long, we'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. Admiral Chen called me to her office 12 hours before the fleet was scheduled to reach our perimeter. She looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen her, but her eyes were still sharp. "Vance, sit down." I did, perching on the edge of a chair that was too uncomfortable for words. "We've mobilized everything we have," she said. 23 battleships, 41 destroyers, and every fighter craft we can get into the air. The planetary defense network is online and operational. "That's good," I said, though I didn't believe it. "It's not enough," she said flatly. "We both know that. Their ships are faster, stronger, better armed, but that's not the real problem." "What is?" She leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine. "The real problem is that we've forgotten how to fight. Our soldiers are trained, but they've never been tested. Our officers are brilliant, but they've never faced a real enemy. We have all the tools of war, but we've lost the instinct to use them." "Then what do we do?" Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her desk and pulled out a data chip. "This is a contingency plan," she said. "One that hasn't been used in 9,000 years. It's a tactical protocol designed for when conventional warfare fails." I looked at the chip. It was old, so old that the casing was cracked and yellowed, but there was something about it that made my skin prickle. "What's on it?" "The Vorkath code," she said. "The last resort." I stared at her, my blood running cold. The Vorkath code was a legend, a myth. It was supposedly developed during the Vorkath War as a way to ensure that humanity could never be completely destroyed. It involved extreme measures. "That's illegal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The Treaty of Callisto specifically banned." "I know what it banned," Chen said, cutting me off. "But the treaty was signed 9,000 years ago by people who couldn't imagine that we'd ever face extinction again. They didn't know what we're facing now." "So you're going to authorize the code?" "If I have to." Her voice was hard. "If it comes to that, I'll authorize it and deal with the consequences later." I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was saying. The Vorkath Code was genocide-level contingency. It was designed to wipe out an enemy species completely, to leave nothing behind but ash and memory. It was the kind of weapon that had been banned by every interstellar treaty we'd ever signed. But it had never been forgotten. "You have 48 hours, Chen said, standing. "Maybe less. I want you to analyze the enemy fleet. Find any weakness, any advantage we can exploit, and if you can't—" She paused, her expression unreadable. "If you can't, I want you to prepare the code for activation." I left her office in a daze. My mind was spinning, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what she just asked me to do. The Vorkath Code was the nuclear option, the weapon we'd sworn never to use again. It was the culmination of all our worst instincts, all our darkest fears. It was what we became when we had no other choice. And now, 9,000 years later, we were facing that choice again. I walked through the corridors of the Defense Corps headquarters, past the soldiers and technicians who were rushing to their stations. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't know that we were considering the unthinkable. I wanted to tell them, I wanted to warn them, but I didn't know what to say. The sky outside the windows was dark now, the city lights sparkling below. It was beautiful in a way that made my heart ache. This was what we were fighting for, this civilization, this life, this world. And I would do whatever it took to protect it. Part 4, The Battle begins. The fleet arrived 2 hours ahead of schedule. I was in the command center when the first alarms went off. Red lights flashed, sirens blared, and Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. All stations prepare for engagement. Enemy ships entering defensive perimeter. I repeat, enemy ships entering defensive perimeter. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the fleet approaching in perfect formation. They were moving slowly now, almost lazily, like they had all the time in the world. "We're transmitting a final warning," Chen said, her voice steady. "Give them a chance to stand down." The transmission went out and we waited. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then the response came. "Humanity, your threats are meaningless. Your weapons are obsolete. Your empire is doomed. Prepare for extinction." The display went dark. "Shields up," Chen ordered. "All weapons lock targets, fire on my command." The space around us erupted into chaos. Energy beams lanced out from our ships, striking the enemy formation. They hit the shields with brilliant flashes of light, but they didn't penetrate. "They're absorbing our fire," someone shouted. "It's not doing anything." I stared at the display, my heart pounding. The enemy ships were returning fire now, their weapons cutting through our defenses like they were made of paper. One of our battleships exploded in a burst of light, its crew gone in an instant. "Fall back," Chen ordered. "Regroup at secondary positions." But there was nowhere to fall back to. The enemy fleet was everywhere, surrounding us, closing in from all sides. "Admiral," I said, my voice barely audible, "we're losing." Chen turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Despair. Then her expression hardened, and she reached for the comm panel. "All units," she said, her voice steady. "Initiate Protocol Omega. I repeat, initiate Protocol Omega." The room went silent. "Protocol Omega, the Vorkath code." "No," I said, stepping forward. "Admiral, you can't. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," she said. "We're outmatched, outgunned, and outnumbered. If we don't use the code, we're all dead." "But the treaty." "The treaty is meaningless if we're extinct." Her voice was hard, final. "I'm giving you an order, Vance. Activate the code." I stared at her, my mind racing. Activating the code meant genocide. It meant wiping out an entire species, just as we'd done to the Vorkath. It meant becoming the monsters we'd sworn we'd never be. But if we didn't? I thought about Marta, the coffee vendor. I thought about her warm smile and her cups of synthetic coffee. I thought about the memorial gardens and the names carved into stone. I thought about everything we'd built, everything we'd achieved. I couldn't let it all be destroyed. "Activating Protocol Omega," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I typed the command sequence into my console, my fingers trembling. The system confirmed the activation, and a progress bar appeared on my screen. 50%, 75%, 90%. Then the enemy fleet stopped moving. "What's happening?" someone shouted. I looked up at the display, my heart in my throat. The enemy ships had frozen in place, their formation breaking apart. The weapons fire stopped. The communication channels went silent. Then a voice came through the comms, but it wasn't the mechanical voice of the enemy. It was a voice I recognized. "Humanity, This is Captain Elias Vance of the Sol Defense Corps. I'm transmitting from the command center of the Obsidian Spire. We've just activated Protocol Omega." There was a pause, a long moment of silence, and then, "It's over." I turned to look at Admiral Chen, my eyes wide. She was staring at the display, her expression unreadable. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The code," she said. "It detected the enemy's ships and transmitted a virus through their systems. They're disabled. Their shields are down, their weapons offline, their communications dead. So we've won." She turned to look at me, her expression hard. "We've survived. That's all we've done." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, relief, exhaustion, something that might have been joy. We'd survived. We'd actually survived. But at what cost? The holographic display flickered and a new image appeared. It showed the enemy fleet floating lifeless in the void. They were completely vulnerable, completely defenseless. And we had the power to destroy them. "Admiral," someone said, their voice hesitant, "what do we do with them?" Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to face the room. "Survivors," she said. "We take survivors. We give them the chance to surrender. And if they don't—" Chen met my eyes, and I saw something in them that made my heart ache. "Then we negotiate, we talk, we find a way to coexist." "But the code—" "The code is a weapon of last resort." Her voice was firm. "We have survived. Now we have to prove that we deserve to." I looked around the room at the faces of my colleagues. They were exhausted, terrified, but there was something else in their eyes now. Hope. We'd survived. Now we had to make sure we'd earned it. Part 5: The Aftermath. The surrender negotiations took 3 weeks. I spent most of that time in the command center, watching the enemy ships float lifeless in the void. They were beautiful in a terrible way, sleek and deadly, designed for war. But they'd lost. They'd challenged humanity and they'd lost. The survivors were brought to the Obsidian Spire under heavy guard. They were tall, pale creatures with elongated limbs and unblinking eyes. They looked like nothing we'd ever seen before. And they were terrified. I watched the first negotiations from the observation deck, my hands pressed against the glass. The alien leaders were seated across from Admiral Chen, their bodies rigid, their eyes darting nervously around the room. "Why did you do it?" Chen asked, her voice calm. "Why did you challenge us?" The alien leader hesitated, then spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "We were told you were weak. We were told you were easy prey." "Who told you that?" The alien looked down at its hands. "A species we encountered, a species that called themselves the Cathar. They said you had grown soft, that your weapons were obsolete, that you would fall easily." Chen's expression was hard. "And what happened to the Cathar?" The alien looked up, and I saw something in its eyes that I'd never seen before. "Shame. We destroyed them. We thought they were lying, that they were trying to trick us. But when we saw your ships, when we saw your weapons, we thought they were right. They were wrong." "Yes," the alien's voice was almost inaudible. "They were wrong." Chen leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the alien. "Let me tell you something," she said. "Humanity has been at peace for 9,000 years. We've spent that time building, growing, learning. We've forgotten how to fight, but we haven't forgotten how to survive." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We didn't want to use the code. We didn't want to destroy you, but we will do whatever it takes to protect ourselves. Do you understand?" The alien nodded, its body trembling. "Do you understand?" Chen repeated, her voice harder now. "Yes," the alien whispered, "I understand." Chen sat back, her expression softening. "Then we can begin negotiations. We will not destroy you. We will not enslave you, but you will leave human space and you will never return." The alien stared at her, clearly not understanding. "We defeated you," Chen said. "We had the power to destroy you, But we chose not to. That's what makes us human." The alien's eyes widened, and I saw something flicker in them. "Respect." "Humans," the alien whispered, its voice trembling. "We were wrong about you. You are not weak. You are not obsolete. You are the strongest species in the galaxy." Chen smiled, a small, sad smile. "We don't want to be the strongest," she said. "We just want to be left alone." Part 6, the piece that FOLLOWED. The aliens left human space 2 months later. I watched them go from the observation deck of the obsidian spire, my hands pressed against the glass. They were small now, just specks in the vastness of space. But they were alive. Admiral Chen stood beside me, her expression unreadable. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I shook my head. I don't know, conflicted, relieved, tired. She laughed, a soft sound that cut through the silence. "That's the problem with being human," she said. "We always have to feel so much." I turned to look at her. "Is that bad?" "No, it's what makes us strong." She met my eyes, and I saw something in them that I'd never seen before. "Wisdom." "We could have destroyed them," she said. "We had the power to end an entire species, but we chose not to." "Because we're human." "Because we're human," she agreed. "Because we've learned that victory isn't about destruction. It's about survival, about building something that lasts." I thought about Marta and her coffee cart. I thought about the memorial gardens and the names carved into stone. I thought about everything we'd built over the past 10,000 years. We'd faced extinction and survived. We'd faced the darkness and emerged into the light. And we'd done it by being human. "She was right," I said, my voice quiet. "The alien leader, she said we're the strongest species in the galaxy." "And you believe that?" "I believe that we're the most stubborn." Chen laughed again, a genuine sound of amusement. "That," she said, "might be the most honest thing I've ever heard." We stood in silence, watching the last ships disappear into the void. The sky was dark now, the stars twinkling overhead. But there was something different about them now. They were no longer just stars. They were reminders of everything we'd fought for, everything we'd survived, everything we'd built. And as I stood there, watching the lights of the city sparkling below, I realized something. 10,000 years of peace, 10,000 years of forgetting what it meant to fight. But we hadn't forgotten how to win. We just remembered how to survive. The sunset over New Alexandria was the color of old blood. I remember that because I was standing in the shadow of the obsidian spire, watching the sky turn dark, and I thought, this is what survival looks like. This is what 10,000 years of struggle looks like. Marta was packing up her cart, her movements slow and careful. "Elias," she called out, her voice tired but warm. "You want the last cup, it's on the house." I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the empty plaza. The coffee was cold, but I drank it anyway. "It's over," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes crinkling. "It's never really over," she said. "That's the thing about being human, we always have to keep going." I nodded because she was right. That was what we did. We kept going, we kept surviving, we kept building. And as I stood there, watching the stars come out one by one, I realized something else. 10,000 years of peace had made us soft, but it had also made us strong, strong enough to survive the darkness, strong enough to build something that lasted, strong enough to win without destroying everything in our path. "Elias," Marta said, her voice soft, "will they come back?" I thought about the aliens, about the terror in their eyes, about the respect that had flickered there at the end. "No," I said, "they won't come back. They've learned what happens when you challenge humanity." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "We've been through this before," she said. "We'll be through it again, that's what we do." I looked at her, at this old woman who'd spent her life selling coffee to soldiers and civilians alike, and I realized something. She was the reason we'd survived. All of us. The ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. The ones who never stopped believing that tomorrow would be better than today. They were the strength of humanity. And no matter how many times we were challenged, they would never give up. I finished my coffee and handed the cup back to her. "Thanks, Marta." She smiled, a warm, genuine smile that cut through the darkness. "See you tomorrow, Elias." I walked away from the cart, my footsteps echoing in the empty plaza. The city was quiet now, the sounds of celebration fading into the night. But I could still hear the echoes. Of the battle, of the fear, of the hope that had risen from the ashes. We had been challenged, and we had won. Not because we were the strongest, not because we had the best weapons or the most advanced technology, but because we were human. And that was enough. The end. Epilogue 10,000 years later. I am old now, old enough to remember, old enough to forget. The obsidian spire still stands, its shadow stretching across the city like a monument to everything we've survived. The memorial gardens are still there, their stones worn smooth by time and weather. And Marta's cart is still there, though Marta herself is long gone. But the coffee is the same, bitter and sweet with just a hint of cinnamon. I sit on the same bench where I sat all those years ago, watching the sunrise paint the sky in gold and amber. The city is alive around me, full of people who have no memory of the war, no memory of the fear, no memory of the hope. But I remember. I remember the darkness. I remember the light. I remember what it felt like to face extinction and refuse to surrender. And I remember what it felt like to win. Because we didn't just survive. We endured, we adapted, we grew. We became something more than we were. And we did it together. I stand up, stretching my old bones, and look out at the city. It's beautiful in a way that still takes my breath away. But I know it wasn't always this way. It was built on sacrifice, on courage, on the refusal to give up. And that's what makes it worth protecting. The sun is rising now, and the sky is alive with color. I think about the words Admiral Chen said to me all those years ago. We don't want to be the strongest, we just want to be left alone. But I know now that we are the strongest. Not because we can destroy, but because we can build. Not because we can fight, but because we can survive. And no matter how many times we're challenged, that's what we'll do. We'll survive. We'll endure. We'll be human.